5.
We have lived under this extraordinary sort of woke tyranny.
4.
Campaigning for this has fallen on the back of just a few journalists and a few academics who have been pilloried throughout by a lot of mainstream broadcasters and politicians.
3.
This will create a massive problem for the economy in general of profit reducing. That is what is driving the stock market down.
2.
But for me as a words person, it's to do with the perversion of language.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Allison, great to have you back. Now, we were going to spend this latest trip on the rocket of right thinking talking about the Scunthorpe steel debacle, which has seen the government desperately trying to buy coke and coal from overseas to keep the UK's last remaining blast furnace open, after it was basically abandoned by its Chinese owners. That's the same government that's just banned the mining of coke and coal in nearby West Cumbria. We were going to talk about two-tier policing, something Prime Minister Keir Starmer's apparently not encouraged, Allison, according to Commons Home Affairs Select Committee, despite your revelations about the case of Lucy Connolly, the mum slammed in jail for 31 months for a social media post she quickly deleted. We were going to talk about the surge in support for Nigel Farage's upstart Reform Party across the traditionally Labour-supporting seats in the Midlands and the North. And there's plenty to say also about Donald Trump's ongoing tariffs, which continue to rock the world economy. We'll come to all that, though, because this morning, co-pilot, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the terms sex and woman in the 2010 Equality Act referenced biological sex rather than acquired gender. It's an absolutely massive verdict, despite, in the minds of almost everyone, being entirely obvious. So let's discuss that case, Allison, and its implications. But first, how was your break?
My first cruise.
You were on a cruise!
Well, normally I travel by rocket, but it was my first cruise. I was aboard the Mark Stein cruise. Some people will know Mark as a brilliant broadcaster, one of the staggeringly talented people that GB News turfed out. Not that we know any of those, Liam Halligan. So it was a bunch of freedom fighters, lots of people who had stood out against lockdown and so on. And Dan Wootton was there and some really fantastic people. I met some of the survivors from the grooming gangs, and we'll be coming back to that soon. But a great time was had by all. Oh, by the way, while I remember, so some fantastic Planet Normal fans were aboard. Michael and Michelle from Ireland.
We're everywhere.
Yes.
On sea and air, across the land.
David from Canada, Cornelius from New Zealand. We've got an open invitation, Halligan, to go down to New Zealand.
We'll have to go backpacking amidst the geezers of Rotorua.
I was being teased, however, everyone coming up and teasing me about my economics prowess. On which subject? This is very disloyal of Planet Normal listeners, because lots of people have written in to say that the episode last week with Tim and Catherine
Was the best ever.
Was the best ever.
I know.
Yeah.
It was all about economics and it was nothing to do with you. Actually, Alison, we have got an announcement to make. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, far be it from me to barge back into my own podcast. But yeah, anyway, what a frabjous day, Halligan, because I am now a woman, which apparently means that at birth I was biologically female. I mean, who knew that's what I was?
You are indeed. This is a massive judgment by the Supreme Court, despite, as I said, being pretty much entirely obvious, because Lord Hodge said the terms sex and woman in the 2010 Equality Act referred to biological sex rather than acquired gender. And the announcement of that verdict at 9:45 on Wednesday morning, long awaited, was met with rapturous celebration by many people outside the Supreme Court, not least Susan Smith of the campaign group who brought the case for Women Scotland. And here's a clip of her now.
Today, the judges have said what we always believed to be the case, that women are protected by their biological sex, that sex is real, and that women can now feel safe that services and spaces designated for women are for women, and we are enormously grateful to the Supreme Court for this ruling.
Well, I think you could hear there in Susan's voice that it's very emotional for women. And in the courtroom, we saw Helen Joyce immediately go over and embrace Maya Forstater. You'll know, Liam, that those are two exceptional women who have suffered horrible personal attacks and career damage for holding so-called gender critical views.
Previous Planet Normal guests, listen to their excellent interviews in our archive.
Absolutely. So it was extraordinary. I mean, I think it's that common sense has become such a rare commodity that when we actually see it being affirmed by a leading institution, you just think...
Tears of joy.
Tears of joy. Thank God someone stated the bleeding obvious. But let's not forget, Liam, the background to this really is I think we've been under a kind of malign spell. There has been this aggressive trans movement, bullying, cowing corporations, institutions. How many politicians have dreaded the question, what is a woman, right? Now, we've had notable people, Kemi Badenoch prominent among them, who have actually boldly stated a man cannot be a woman. But we had our Prime Minister, you may remember Keir Starmer saying, it shouldn't be said that only a woman can have a cervix. Yes, it bloody well should. I mean, that's the kind of nonsense, a sort of tyranny of nonsense that we have lived under, and it has percolated corporations and the NHS and the police everywhere you look. So, as I said, I think we have lived under this extraordinary sort of woke tyranny, and the dam broke today.
Why does it matter so much, though? Why do so many people, not least women, find it so offensive and indeed scary when trans rights are expressed in a certain way?
Well, I think it's partly because when I was young, and I know you've got daughters, I've got a daughter. I think when I was a sort of young feminist, we thought this category of woman, that the fight for women and the fight for feminism was about making the category of woman as capacious as possible, right? You could be Barbie at one end, and at the other end, you could be in your Doc Martens and your dungarees, and you were still a woman, right?
Homemaker or CEO, whatever you want to do with your life.
Whatever you wanted to be, you could be it. And suddenly, if you'd said to me when I was 20, do you realise that the competition is going to come not from you trying to fight a male establishment, but from men declaring that they are women? I mean, we see these astonishing spectacles of beauty pageants being won by men.
We see two biological men competing in women's sports in the final against each other.
Yes, I mean, there are particular flashpoints for me. The idea, and I've heard from a female prison governor, been at an event where she broke down in tears saying that there were very vulnerable women in her prison who had to be in the showers when someone would come in with a penis. I mean, can you imagine it? It's absolutely astonishing. And obviously this particular case, which originated in Scotland, where we had Nicola Sturgeon forcing through this dreadful ideology. And I think things started to crack, Liam, didn't they? Do you remember the Isla Bryson case where a man who was a rapist, surprisingly, because men tend to be the only ones who could be rapists, was put on a pair of skin-tight pink lycra leggings and announced that he was a woman and would therefore be getting a jammier time in a woman's prison.
After the incident.
Massive calculation and cynicism there. So I think this has been incredibly upsetting. It's a huge threat. And I think that it's a shame, it shouldn't have been necessary. Just wanted to read, actually, Liam, I said to you earlier that something amazing, a great essay I read this week in the New Statesman by the philosopher John Gray. And this is just a little bit.
Brilliant writer.
John Gray says, woke hyperliberalism is not an assault on Christianity, but an impoverished and extreme version of it, emptied of Jesus's gospel of forgiveness and Augustine's acceptance of original sin. Woke is a religion of merciless punishment of anyone who refuses to bow to the latest fashion in victimhood. In the US, woke's affinities with Puritanism are unmistakable. If Western civilization is in decline, John Gray continues, it is not because Christianity has been forsaken. Instead, the West's founding religion has mutated into an anti-Western progressive ideology. I think he's put it brilliantly there, really. This trans cult has been a religion. And God forbid, if you work in the media, if you work in anywhere, people are sacked for using the wrong pronouns. We had an email from a school teacher who'd gone in one day, and some girl had decided overnight that she was a boy. And the teacher was summoned to the head teacher to explain why she had misgendered this kid, right? This stuff is actually happening. And I tell you, Liam, something I thought yesterday, as when we're listening to the podcast, that if you'd had someone from 100 years ago in that court, or indeed from 40 years ago, and you'd sat them down, they literally wouldn't have had a clue what was going on, would they?
We'd seem like another race, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
Another species entirely. And the huge amount of court time and resource that was spent on this at a time when there's a massive backlog in the courts and people can't get basic access to justice to assert something that is so screamingly obvious to so many of us. Something that's really struck me about this is that so many of the people campaigning for this to overturn the efforts of Nicola Sturgeon in the Scottish court, she's really lost out now, hasn't she? It was the Supreme Court that stopped her, in my view, anti-democratic attempts to try and get another referendum on Scotland very soon after she lost the last one. And now the Supreme Court has stopped her in her tracks, albeit since she stepped down as First Minister of Scotland. But something that strikes me is campaigning for this has fallen on the back of just a few journalists and a few academics who have been pilloried throughout by a lot of mainstream broadcasters and politicians. The political and media class has massively failed during this debate, it strikes me, and sat on their hands while ordinary people have suffered. There's just been a few people, and you mentioned two of them there, Helen Joyce and Maya Forstater, who have really put their head above the parapet. Someone else I'd like to mention in dispatches, another previous Planet Normal guest, is Sharon Davis, who has campaigned tirelessly when it comes to women's rights in sport. I do think there is now a sea change happening there. Some sports are holding out with a really regressive, stuck-in-the-mud ideology, but a number of leading sports now are seeing sense and making sure that there are biological women-only categories in their sports, not least at the elite level where it matters so much. And the other observation for me, and even though I do take such a keen interest in this debate, I do feel like an observer, and I know lots of men do feel as observers, however supportive we are. It's been the age breakdown of the women who have really campaigned for this. It has been the so-called TERFs, an awful term, but a term which many campaigning women have sort of adopted in order to stop other people using it as a term of abuse. Trans-exclusionary radical feminist, a term that's nonsensical. Why is it radical to think that biological sex is real? But most of the campaigners have been, with huge respect, middle-aged women and older, and there have been very few younger women. There have been a few, but I know from my own family's experiences on university campuses, it's been really hard for young women to speak out about this stuff and to try and assert the case for the ascendancy of biological sex over gender, if you like. It's been an absolute minefield for lots of young students.
Obviously, it's to do with fairness, but for me as a words person, it's to do with the perversion of language. People are actually telling you you cannot speak the truth. In fact, you will be penalised. So we have mothers in the NHS in some trusts referred to as birthing persons. No, baby is in a uterus. It comes out through a vagina. It feeds from its mother, and the mother has a breast. It's not a chest feeder. And on, this unbelievably ugly, cumbersome language, which is like a cage that's put over the truth. And the truth now can breathe again, and it's a huge victory. We should also mention the Telegraph's own Suzanne Moore,
absolutely,
of course J.K. Rowling, who's been front and centre, leveraging her huge status, and of course because she's obviously so wealthy, they can't really bring her down, and she has been absolutely consistent and fighting furiously against just rubbish. I mean, this is the thing, as Kemi Badenoch said today of the judgment, you cannot change your biological sex. Saying trans women are women was never true, in fact, and now isn't true in the law either, right? So insisting people say things that aren't true and penalising them if they fail to agree. We often talk, don't we, Liam, on Planet Normal about some of the sort of Kafkaesque aspects. We're talking about the non-crime hate incidents and so on. Until yesterday, somebody saying, well, I don't think that bloke's a girl, could get you a non-crime hate incident, couldn't it?
Absolutely, and you know all about that. Is this a turning point now, Alison, or is it just a milestone? Do you think this will reverberate across our political and media class now? Do you think this will mean that we go back to some kind of what you and I would see as sanity on this issue? Or do you think there'll be a backlash against these campaigning women? I mean, there already is across parts of the media. I was listening to the radio just before we started recording Planet Normal, and you had a radio presenter who shall remain nameless, who was having a go at the women outside the Supreme Court. Why are they shouting and cheering? What are they so scared of? Why do they think that this is such a huge issue? Outrageous.
Well, it's I'm afraid underpinning it is a terrible misogyny. I've come to the conclusion. I think that whatever the excuse is given, and to be told as a woman, be kind because that person who's a man is claiming they're you. What's kind about that? So all the language, as I said, has been perverted. I think in answer to your question, Liam, I would say that this is a 2 milestones now. So we had the Hillary Cass report, which very firmly came down against unevidenced giving children puberty blockers with all the potential lifelong harms that engenders. Now, there's obviously been some pushback there in the counselling and therapeutic community, but at least Cass drew the line. And I think what this does as well is it says legally, right, a biological male who identifies as a woman cannot be deemed a woman even if they've got a gender recognition certificate, right? So that's the law now. So people, at least school teachers getting things wrong, doctors getting things wrong, these people cannot be prosecuted. So it lifts the reign of terror. I personally would like to see Stonewall disbanded. I think the way it's gone from being an admirable organisation campaigning for gay rights to a furiously pro-trans organisation which has infiltrated corporations, becoming a Stonewall champion, is seen by many of these firms and huge businesses.
Loads of taxpayers' money was spent on them by moronic civil servants so they could feel good about themselves.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Absolutely outrageous.
So let's see some legal actions. In fact, Maya Forstater did win her case, didn't she? But really, basically now we're on firmer ground when we say, I'm not going to do that. Now, you will remember, Liam, and this is no particular criticism of the Telegraph, but I did a column where I was talking about this person who had done a big magazine spread calling himself a pregnant man. And I was at great pains in the column to, as you can imagine, co-pilot, to say, yeah, that's not a pregnant man, because men can't get pregnant. I'm just about on for the virgin birth, but we're not having.
When you use that tone of voice, I shiver, Alison. I get so scared. Yes. I'm so glad on this occasion, in this conversation, you're on my side.
It's my scrotum shrivelling voice, Liam. So I wrote about, in quite unfavourable terms, about the pregnant man. Just to cut a long story short, the piece appeared on the Telegraph website and lots of the readers were furious. And they said, why have you called this person he, Allison, when you object to it? And the sub-editor at that time had changed all the pronouns, Liam, in line with semi-official, not official, but the kind of guidance, really. And when I looked into it more closely, it seemed that, yes, as an opinion columnist, I was allowed to call that person she because it was a pregnant person, but that would elicit huge numbers of complaints to the Telegraph. It wasn't a legal matter. I was allowed to do it legally, but the Telegraph and any other media organisation could expect to get huge amounts of complaints, and then they'd have to go through this very, very lengthy press complaints procedure. So what's happened, Liam, is many organisations, including obviously media organisations, self-censored.
Well, hopefully that will now stop with this Supreme Court verdict.
And someone said to me, an editorial person said to me, oh, you're the one who doesn't like to fall into line. And I said, yeah, because I'm not going to write stuff that's not true. But you can see that there was as we described it, a kind of tyranny of thought, and people were scared to call a person the wrong gender. Can I just say, by the way, that I don't I still think that whatever people are, they should be absolutely treated with respect and so on.
Of course you do. Of course
And,
you do.
Whoever I meet, I speak respectfully. I just don't think we can have a society that's based on clearly a biological nonsense. And now another story this week, Liam, which actually is linked to this. The Telegraph did a big thing about NHS trusts discriminating against white job applicants by manipulating interview shortlists in favour of ethnic minority candidates for the sake of inclusivity. And a hospital consultant friend of mine was saying he reacted to this with what he described as utter despair, total disaster, driven by woke managers. Consultants have no input into the selection process anymore. Command of the English language no longer a prerequisite. That's for being a doctor. And when I looked it up, Liam, yes, sure enough, behind this further madness is the 2010 Equality Act, which made it legal to take positive action to support the recruitment of ethnic minorities. Again, I don't think that having a diverse pool from which you fish, to hire, and having people from all sorts of backgrounds and political views and so on, that's clearly a good idea. But what we saw from this story, not just in the NHS, but God forbid, in the police, West Yorkshire Police had temporarily blocked applications from white candidates, right? And this is now, I think, this pursuit of diversity for diversity's sake has ended up creating a repellent anti-white racism. So I see the trans situation and this, they're all linked together. There is a woke tyranny, a capture of the institutions, if you like.
There certainly is, Allison, and I think it's right that we've spent a lot of time at the top of this planet, normal, talking about this issue. So many other things to be discussed this week in the short period of time we got left, not least two-tier care. And also, we wanted to talk briefly about Lucy Connolly.
Yeah, listeners will, I hope, have seen my large piece on Lucy Connolly, which was published in the Telegraph just before I went away. It was a very long, heavily researched piece, 6,000 words. And Lucy, in my mind, was certainly a victim of two-tier justice, two-tier policing. Although, as Liam said at the top, there was a report this week by the Home Affairs Select Committee, a committee of MPs, into the policing of last summer's riots, which were triggered by the Southport massacre of those little girls. And the committee found it no evidence of two-tier policing. In fact, it says such claims were baseless, unsubstantiated.
Not a sausage.
Not a sausage.
None at all.
And disgraceful. Honestly, Liam, there are so many examples of two-tier policing, not the least of which, of course, is Lucy has been in jail since August for posting a very, very unpleasant and nasty tweet.
Let's not be modest about this, Allison. You have moved the dial on this issue. The case of Lucy Connolly had largely fallen out of public consciousness. The fact that you contacted her family, the fact that you talked to her husband, Ray Connolly, about the family situation. They've got a young daughter. The family is, of course, bereaved. They lost a child in early infancy due to issues within the NHS, unfortunately. Very tragic that happened. You delved into the family background, Lucy's relationship with lots and lots of mums in her role as a childminder, mums of kids from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds.
Oh, yes.
You wrote this incredibly powerful piece of, if you like, woman-to-woman journalism, with you basically speaking up for a woman held in prison for 31 months for a social media posting she quickly deleted. And very soon after that, the leader of the opposition was putting things out on social media. It became a much talked about story. Many other journalists followed up your story, a few of them not even acknowledging that it was yours, your quotes, which was not on in our trade. And it strikes me there is now a concerted campaign to examine the case of Lucy Connolly, and maybe even her term could be shortened.
Well, she's got an appeal on the 15th of May. I'm very sad to report that her treatment in prison is arguably been made more difficult by my piece. I felt very guilty when I heard that the prison governors had said to her that due to her speaking to the press, she had had childcare right of temporary leave. They weren't going to grant it, but Lucy has assured me that she was sure they weren't going to grant it to her anyway.
To be clear, she didn't speak to you directly because that's not allowed in this country.
No.
She spoke to you via her husband.
She did. Her situation is unbelievable, Liam. It's unbelievable. And when these politicians, Keir Starmer at the time, people remember last July promising harsh punishments for those who were feeding a far-right narrative with misinformation. I'll tell you who was feeding a far-right narrative with misinformation was Keir Starmer, all the chief constables, the Home Secretary, the Deputy Prime Minister, who absolutely withheld the information they knew full well about Axel Ritter-Cabana. And there is something, a bit of a scoop, actually, which Liam and I talked about earlier. A senior serving police officer told me that there was an operation where every police force in the country was on standby for this particular date on which the government planned to finally release the truth about Ritter-Cabana, his terror manual, the fact he had a bioweapon, all the details about him. So Keir Starmer would pick the moment to reveal the appalling terrorism details, which in fact he knew within hours of that horrific teenager being arrested. Now, I think that Lucy was a victim of that. I think she has been treated as a political prisoner. I've had a lot of time to think about this, Liam, and I'll tell you what I've arrived at. This is about state control. There are two different kinds of policing going on. There's the policing of the white majority. As the diversity is our strength narrative gradually unravels, more and more people now are saying, hang on a minute, there seem to be quite a lot of drawbacks to that. As that narrative is unraveling, we are seeing an appeasement of the aggressive Islamist members of the Muslim community. I shared with Liam, Planet Normal listeners, an absolutely astonishing video which was taken last August, in which a police officer is talking to a group of Muslim men and suggesting that they put their weapons in the mosque and put them away and come back and collect them later. Now, I can tell you, co-pilot, if that had been a group of white protesters with weapons, they wouldn't have been told them to stash them in a church, would they?
Now, Allison, you're not the only one who's been away lately, because I managed to grab a few days in Italy's wonderful Motor Valley, known locally as Emilia-Romagna. Now, Motor Valley, stretching across northern Italy, roughly from Parma in the centre through Modena to Bologna and Rimini on the Adriatic coast, is known across the world for automotive excellence. It's the birthplace and manufacturing hub of countless world-class prestige car makers like Ferrari, Lamborghini, Maserati and Pagani. Motor Valley's home to countless smaller firms too, making automotive components, just like in the Midlands or the North East, the UK's car-making heartlands. Now, I made this trip, Allison, as I quite like motorbikes, and I was invited to visit the factory of Ducati just outside Bologna, Ducati being the maker of those iconic red racing bikes which enjoy a cult following around the world, their devoted owners known as Ducatisti. Ducati just posted results showing annual turnover of more than €1 billion for the third year in a row. The company's branching out and has lately started selling off-road bikes too, which are selling quite well. But the day before I arrived in Bologna, Donald Trump announced a 20% tariff on goods made in the European Union sold in the US, a market that accounts for 15% of Ducati's sales. So I took the opportunity to talk about that to the Ducati CEO, Claudio Domenicalli. I started by pointing out that manufacturing firms making high-end consumer goods, wherever they're based, are at the whim of global economic sentiment.
So I think you're quite right. And the question is very interesting. To be honest, I would have given you a different answer if it was posted 2 days ago, because actually now everything changes.
Yeah.
And so we are in front of something which is, in my opinion, unpredictable.
Yeah. almost unprecedented. Of course, we're talking about Trump's tariffs.
Yeah.
We're still absorbing the news.
It is for sure
Trump
unprecedented.
announced 24 hours ago there's going to be a 25% tariff on all foreign automotives sold in America. And I'm assuming that applies to motorcycles as well.
Yeah, it's not applying to motorcycle because that are cars. But for motorcycle, apply the 20% duty that is global on every good supplied from Europe.
Okay.
So it's not just cars, but actually there have been the announcement that everything that is imported into US for everywhere in the world will be subject to 10% tax on top of what it was previously existing.
Yeah.
So it's 10 plus minimum.
Yeah.
But Europe is 20.
And European Union is 20. Okay.
20 plus.
I didn't realize that. I thought you may come under the car.
No.
So not as bad as 25, but 20 is still enormous.
Okay.
I mean, what's that going to do to your margins? What share of your bikes do you sell in America?
Around 15%, 1.5.
Wow.
So it's a big problem. But actually, I think that the problem is it's bigger because every good imported into US, even sold by fully US company, will be subject to duties.
Yeah.
So shoes, brands, clothes brand,
Nike's produced in the Philippines or Vietnam, of course.
Furniture, office, home, windows, trucks, you name it, you know?
I mean, how has Ducati responded? What's been going on internally since in the last 24 hours?
But actually, I'm saying that this will create a massive problem for the economy in general of profit reducing. That is what is driving the stock market down so much.
You're talking about the US economy too, right?
Yeah, but today, Italian stock market is going down 7%. Yesterday, Nasdaq was going down 5%. So it's not a problem of actually the price increasing potentially, but also of
systemic financial danger.
Systemic financial danger,
right?
And feeling of the people to feel less wealthy than they were just 3 months ago.
Yeah.
So I think that before that, we had a system that had problem to grow. Now we are in front of the, in my opinion, potential disruption, which is quite bigger. I'm not a full economist, to be honest, but we are...
Maybe you're a business leader. You're more important than an economist. You actually employ thousands of people. You are in charge of an incredible Italian brand, a leading manufacturing.
We will try to be as flexible as possible to react quickly.
What's it going to do to your sales in the US?
We are discussing how to present ourselves on the market, but there will be potentially some split of the burden between final client, ourselves, and the distribution network. We will try to keep the distribution network as healthy as possible because this is very, very important. We will absorb as much of the damage we can, but finally...
Your own margins.
Yes. Finally, some will have to be readdressed to the final client.
I mean, look, let's cite in your press release that just last week you announced very good financial results.
Yes.
A margin that was still roughly around 10%.
Yeah, 9%.
Like last year and this year. So a 20% increase in the price of your product just wipes out your margin and more.
Yeah. You name it, you know. So actually, it's kind of, but this is, you know, there are not many companies generally, if you get out of luxury, that there's a margin in excess of 20%.
Absolutely.
So it's impossible that actually a normal company can absorb fully a 20% margin on the long term. You may do for a couple of months, you may do in a kind of an interim, you know.
What do you think is going to happen here? You've been around in business a long time. What's going to happen between the US and the European Union? Do you think the European Union is going to retaliate? Do you think the European Union should retaliate? Or do you think in the end, what Trump's trying to do is use the threat of tariffs in the short term in order to get lower tariffs overall in the long term? For instance, the Americans and the Indians now look closer to doing a trade deal than they were 24 hours ago.
Correct.
Because the Indians are saying, okay, yeah, we put these tariffs on you, we'll drop some. Could that happen with the European Union?
Not sure, but I think that would be my preferred way to go.
Yeah.
Because free trade is an advantage for everything and for everyone, for jobs to remain in every single country. And so I think that primary goal of European Union should be to try to keep jobs safe in the European community. And so I think that it's possible to do when you reduce as much as possible trade barrier. And some of the trade barrier existing before, I think should be rediscussed and negotiated. And so find a solution which is not answering back and then discussing the answer back of US again and then answering back to the answer back. So it's kind of a spiral that I think will finally damage heavily both of us.
A downward spiral indeed. Now, of course, Ducati is a very distinctive Italian brand. You have your own DNA, you have your own culture, but of course you're owned by Audi, you're part of the Volkswagen group. So this automotive tariff is affecting the broader group in some sense. How concerned are you here, just to be really blunt about it? This is a historic moment, it seems to me. How concerned are you about the damage that could be done to Ducati from these tariffs if the geopolitics goes wrong, if the diplomacy goes wrong? What's your best case scenario and what's your worst case scenario?
Yeah, the best case scenario is actually that all of this confusion is the starting point to generate a discussion that can be much quicker than it would have been without the confusion.
Yeah.
The case of India that you named.
Yeah. So this could kickstart serious trade negotiations about removing tariffs.
I do not know if it could, but actually it's the best case scenario.
Yeah.
Best case scenario is that we're making a big confusion, but finally we find a negotiation solution.
Yeah.
Worst case scenario is actually we start on a spiral that we cannot see where is the end. Because actually, if we now calculate the damage and we retaliate back with the same amount of damage, and US retaliate back on the same retaliation with double the amount of damage, and then we triple the amount of damage. Finally, we come back to some kind of medial age economy where every country produce only for the same
like
country.
The Middle Ages.
It's a Middle Age. So actually, it's but this is the worst case scenario.
Yeah. Where do you think this is going to end up? What does your instinct tell you? Okay, I think that there will be lots of shouting and screaming. And I think that in the end, most big countries, including the European Union, Japan, UK, India seems to be on its way, will come to some kind of accommodation with America. I think there will be some kind of accommodation. I don't think that in his heart, Trump really wants a completely isolated America. I think in his heart, he wants free trade or freer trade than we currently have. What do you think?
You are in a much better observation point than mine. So I really would like that this is the reality, So this would be reasonable and logical. And so we may discuss about the opportunity of doing in such a way, but actually, if the final result is actually that there are more free trade than it was before, actually we got a result finally.
But even if I'm right, in the meantime, he could do tremendous damage.
Yeah, but still it's much less than what you got if it's consolidated for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
And actually you start creating manufacturing sites abroad and creating unemployment in many countries. And for my understanding, actually unemployment is very low in US now, which actually, even if you transfer there, like kind of when you do like this.
Snap your fingers.
Snap your finger.
Yeah.
It's just snapping your finger. You transfer all the manufacturing in the US. You're missing the labor.
Yeah.
So
it's very skilled labor. Takes a long time to train.
And actually, supply chain, you're not building, even if you build a factory, then you need all the employee. And
He's overestimating the extent to which manufacturing can move to the US, right?
For sure, there are a number of difficulties. And so it's strongly advisable that actually a solution can be found.
Just finally, Mr. Domenicalli, what would you say to people in Britain who are thinking about buying a new motorbike? Me, why should I buy a Ducati?
Oh, it's pretty easy because it's one of the sexiest, if not the sexiest motorcycle on the planet. So the answer is this time it was more difficult on the tariff subject, but why to buy a Ducati? And actually, if you want really to shoot for the best and you're type of a person which is sensible on emotion and performance and the best quality material then Ducati is almost obvious choice. Not to mention that actually when you are becoming a Ducatista, then you can get for free a show that starts every 2 Sundays in MotoGP, and actually you become part of the show. So you're not just looking at the races like a general spectator, but you're looking as a part of the family. And so it's much more emotional, and so it's the entertainment become much stronger.
Claudio Domenicalli, CEO of Ducati, the sexiest motorcycles on earth. Officially, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
There you go, something a bit different. As we go into the Easter weekend, Allison, the sun's out, hopefully looking forward to a nice summer. I thought you'd want to hear from my little trip in Motor Valley. I have to tell you, Motor Valley was a complete revelation to me. Obviously, I knew about it from a sort of economic point of view, an industrial point of view, over 100,000 employees working in automotives. But it's got 13 specialised museums, car museums, Ferrari, Lamborghini, Ducati, 4 racetracks. And of course, the food is sensational. I mean, I know your fantastic him indoors wrote a brilliant piece in the New Yorker about risotto.
Yes.
Stirring stuff, it was called. That was a brilliant headline. Bologna in the centre of Motor Valley is basically the risotto capital of the world. But Parma, where you get the famous ham, is just up the road. Rimini, absolutely sensational seafood. It's a fantastic place. And you have to hand it to the Italians, They are really good design manufacturers, and they do absolutely fantastic food.
It sounded to me like the perfect Halligan midlife crisis toy. If we see you whizzing on a Ducati through the lanes outside Saffron Walden.
Well, I've ridden scooters for quite a long time, as you know. I did have proper motorbikes in my youth, but not for a long time. But look, in all seriousness, there was news in that interview. It wasn't just, me and motorbikes. And there you had a major CEO, right, of a major European blue ribbon manufacturer owned by obviously a much bigger manufacturer. And he's responding in real time to Trump's tariffs. It was very kind of him to talk to me when I suggested that we discuss this. He didn't have to. I was there to look at the museum. And he's basically saying, there may be a deal to be done here. It may be that the European Union needs to drop some of its protection on America. It will certainly be damaging for manufacturers, automotives, and indeed motorcycles. Motorcycles having a 20% tariff. Since that interview, of course, which we were literally doing as news was coming onto the wires, since that interview, Trump has paused those so-called reciprocal tariffs, the bigger tariffs, the 20% tariffs, on European Union exports. It's basically the flat 10% tariff at the moment for the world, unless you're Chinese. And the Chinese tariffs on America and the American tariffs on China are, of course, now way above triple digits. There's been a kind of Dutch auction. It's become completely absurd. The tariffs are so high, they're basically, each capital is stalling the trade in goods between the world's 2 biggest economies. And there's been lots of financial market reverberations. In recent days, financial markets have calmed a bit because Trump has pulled the world back from the brink. But this is a major, major issue now. It may be that Trump will succeed in convincing the rest of the world to lower its tariffs on America. I mentioned to Claudio Domenicalli, and he agreed, and that's happened more since we had the discussion, that the Americans and the Indians are moving towards a trade deal. India, actually, for all its industrial prowess, has been incredibly protectionist over recent years against all goods from the West. Obviously, it's going to be the biggest market in the world soon in terms of numbers of people. Very valuable market. And also, and this is really interesting, something I've been saying since almost the moment Trump announced these tariffs, it may be that the UK and the US can do a trade deal. And that's what was the subject of my column in last Sunday's Telegraph, link in the show notes to this episode. Why? Because Trump now needs some quick wins. He needs to show that this is not just about vandalism and shock and awe and making himself, yet again, the centre of everyone's attention. This is actually about trying to do trade deals that lead to lower trade barriers overall. And if that is the case, and people around him claim that is still his aspiration and his aim, then he needs to show that big economies will come to America and do those trade deals that are mutually beneficial, lowering tariff barriers overall. And what better big economies to do a deal with than the Brits? That's why I think the UK now has a better chance of securing a trade deal with America, a trade deal with the world's biggest economy, which has been elusive. The European Union hasn't managed to do that in decades of attempts. If the Brits do a trade deal with America, and that would mean that a fifth of our trade is with America, it's our biggest single country trading partner. If the Brits can do a trade deal with America applying to goods, and that trade proportion to America goes up, and that helps to engender growth, that will be game changing for Trump. Other countries will then think, well, this is doable. He's not completely mad. There is some order in this chaos. There is some method in this madness. And that's why I think Keir Starmer, ironically, who never wanted Brexit, of course, who spent the beginning of his time in Parliament trying to reverse Brexit, it may be that Brexit allows him to pull off something really quite sensational that will be pro-growth and will be pro-free markets, do his electoral chances no end of good across the majority of the electorate, and will be noticed around the world as an example of genuine statecraft. It could well happen.
He could certainly do with some good news. Just briefly, The Sun broke ranks this week with a huge thing about Britain is broken. 68% of people polled agreed that Britain is broken, and they were foregrounding Liam Nigel Farage reform on 30%. Nige Mayor on Downing Street, The Sun trumpeted. And I think that that's why we've seen this flurry of activity to keep the Scunthorpe Steelworks open. Now you're going to be amazed by this, co-pilot, because the government is importing 55,000 tonnes, that's £700 million of coking coal to keep the Scunthorpe Steelworks going from Japan. Now, as everyone knows, Japanese coal doesn't cause climate change, you see, because, coking coal that comes from Scotland or South Wales is a big problem for climate change.
And the diesel fumes of the container ship that carried the coking coal, that doesn't cause climate change either.
No, so we actually have our own, the Miliband Eco-Nuts, who refused the mining licenses to the mines.
Just across the country.
Where we could mine our own coal. But no, I do think this Scunthorpe Steelworks is a very interesting story. Labour government recalled Parliament on Saturday, trying to look like it was a huge deal, like millions of people don't work on Saturday. All the Labour MPs were on message, tweeting, "We are saving steel." Liam, this is the government whose pursuit of net zero has caused the crisis, the highest industrial electricity prices pretty much in the world, which is deindustrializing our nation. And they have the almighty nerve to take credit for saving the Scunthorpe Steelworks.
At this rate, co-pilot, you're going to turn into one of those old-fashioned 1970s industrial correspondents. It'll be Allison Pearson in her kitten heels, in her fuchsia mules, and she'll be wearing a lumberjack jacket, standing round a barrel with a fire inside, warming her hands. Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
Robert asks, will the Supreme Court be slapped with a non-crime hate incident for finding that a woman is a biological female? Well, anyone's got one of those, Robert. We've all got a non-crime hate incident. And Carol says, thank you, Allison, for your wonderful article on Lucy Connolly. I'm so pleased you've highlighted her case. I was a magistrate for 35 years, and I was absolutely horrified at the sentences handed down in the wake of the Southport murders. In most cases, they were extreme, no doubt to serve as a warning to others. In addition, we saw judges handing down these sentences nightly on our TV screens. I didn't recognise the judicial system I'd been part of for over 3 decades, says Carol. And for the first time in my life, I felt both shame and embarrassment for my country. In my time on the bench, custody was always the very last sentencing option if appropriate alternatives were available and were a suitable punishment for the crime committed, taking all factors into account. We have recently witnessed the sentencing of an MP who viciously attacked a constituent, receiving a suspended prison term, but that sentence seemed to be not available to Lucy Connolly, a woman with no previous conviction and a non-violent crime. I really hope Lucy has top-class representation at her appeal in May. And don't get me started on the grooming gangs and the reluctance of top CPS lawyers to get involved. That is another national disgrace. I was going to comment on Allison's article online, says Carol, but then I paused and wondered if I would have a knock on the door for criticising the sentencing policy of this government. Goodness, what a sorry state we are in, that I should feel fearful of speaking my mind in our once great and free country. Should you want to organise a free Lucy Connolly protest march or any other protest against this dreadful regime, I'm in, says Carol. Well, just to say, Liam, that I am looking at organising a Just Giving page for Lucy because Ray and the family are really hard up against it now, and several very kind readers and listeners have said they'd love to make a bit of a contribution to the family. So I'll keep you posted on that.
This is from John. Alison and Liam, who could have predicted that the UK should be in charge of its own steel production and the fuel needed for the furnaces and not rely on the whims of an authoritarian regime?
Who knew?
Best wishes, John. And this is from Annalise. Dear Alison and Liam, what a great podcast last week with Liam and Tim.
Oh.
Not Alison. Just saying. The only economic logic I have comes from listening to Planet Normal, and I often have to listen twice to get to grips with all the information, but it was fascinating to hear Catherine McBride's thoughts, as well as somewhat of a relief to hear that there is actually a plan within the White House. Alison, your article on two-tier care, as always, really hit the mark. Every week you somehow manage to write my thoughts about the week's horrors, and it clears my head. It's a form of therapy, some sort of weird cathartic experience. This week I have nothing to add, so I thought I'd try to challenge Bob the Bard, of course, Planet Normal's well-known superlative poet. I've always been utterly useless at poetry, as you will see, but I thought you could cringe at my expense. So here we are. This is from Annalise. We have the most useless PM called Keir, whom we have had to endure for a year. I only wish his surname was Hunt, so I could give him the title of Cabbage. My husband Matt had a go too, with somewhat more success. With taxes becoming a farce, writes Matt, the future of Britain's now cast. With my pension disappearing and Reeves thick and sneering, I may as well shove it up my mattress. Happy Easter to you both, with much gratitude, Annalise and Matt.
By the way, also, I agree, Annalise, I listened to Planet Normal twice. The astonishingly good episode without me in it, I listened to it.
No, you're overdoing it now.
It's true. It's true. I listened to it. And this is from David. Dear Alison Liam, says David, I've been an avid follower of Planet Normal since the beginning. And I have to say, oh, here we go. There have been many outstanding episodes over the years, but last week's, sorry, Alison, was the best yet.
Who chooses these emails? I have no idea.
I noticed you put this one in. Tim Stanley and Catherine McBride deliver dazzling insight, both historical and economic, into the murky world of tariffs. With my own credentials, says David, consisting of one economics grade A O-level from 1979 and 35 years of active investing, i.e. occasionally getting lucky and pretending it was skill, I found their contributions incredibly enlightening. Catherine's explanations of how tariffs, both direct and sneakily indirect, are implemented and dodged around the globe was especially illuminating. Both she and Tim managed to provide thoughtful, articulate counterpoints to the standard issue, hair-on-fire reaction to President Trump's policies. It was refreshing to hear a proper grown-up conversation for once. No shouting, no slogans, and not a single influencer in sight. Forget Adolescence, that's the BBC drama. That Planet Normal episode should be required listening for everyone from sixth formers to silver surfers. I'm not naturally a fan of tariffs, says David. I tend to assume they mean higher prices for my wine. But this was a brilliant piece of podcasting that made me think, which, let's face it, is a rare achievement for anything involving trade policy. Thank you again for being a weekly dose of sanity in an increasingly bonkers world. Long may Planet Normal orbit. Very best regards, David. Lovely email, David.
And finally, again on our Italian theme, Alison, this is from Kate from sunny Porthcawl. Dear Allison and Liam, I've tried to escape the depression that's being imposed on us by Rachel from accounts by having a touring holiday in Italy with my half-Italian husband. We started our trip in Frascati and enjoyed the bars and restaurants, which we noticed, while not full, tourist season has not really begun yet, were very lively. Many local people eating in large groups, not just at weekends, but early in the week, both lunch and dinner. The food, as always, was stunning, but what struck us was the price. A 3-course lunch for €16 was not uncommon. Talking to my husband's family, we learnt that there is no minimum wage in Italy and that generally wages are lower than in the UK, where we find it too expensive to eat out. What's also striking is the passion that the Italians have for their heritage and local traditions. They're not ashamed, but are in fact proud of their history. Back in Wales, I work for a small dairy farm, says Kate. I can only imagine the pain that my boss is now going through with the rise in the minimum wage, but more so the change to national insurance contributions, which have dragged many part-time workers like myself into its net. Having been a small business employer in the past, I know that these costs, while not often talked about, can be devastating. Also, with two-tier care talking about relaxing standards of American food imports, this would be yet another blow to British farmers, who I believe can't take any more of a battering. Anyway, I'm off to Sicily tomorrow, so I'll cheer up before heading home to a dose of reality. Love your podcast. All the best, Kate. And that's it from Planet Normal for another week, as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views. Email of the week. Allison?
I think we're going to give it to David, even though he said that the best episode of Planet Normal ever didn't feature me. How magnanimous is that?
There you go, David. Send us an email to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Put mug winner in your subject heading, and your rarest rocking horse poo Planet Normal mug will be winging its way to you.
Now, Conrad Starmer only likes to mention festivals that aren't related to the indigenous culture. He didn't mention Palm Sunday, but he has mentioned everybody else's religious festivals. So just to break the trend, I'm wishing you all from Planet Normal a very happy Easter.
Indeed, and as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of planet Earth comes back into view, thanks as ever to our producers Isabel Bouchard, Cass Ho and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.